Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Democracy and Technology's 7th Annual Future of Speech Online event. My name is Emma Alonso. I'm the Director of the Free Expression Project at CDT, and I'll be your MC throughout today's and tomorrow's two-day event. The Future of Speech Online is our yearly opportunity to put a spotlight on a key topic that is shaping how we will use the internet and digital technologies to speak and to access information for years to come. This year's theme is one of the hottest topics in tech policy today, generative AI. As policymakers, advocates, industry, and the broader public begin to grapple with what generative machine learning systems can really do, we wanted to use this event to really dig into the details. How do these systems work? What kinds of technical and policy choices are being made in their design, development, and deployment? And how does that affect the risks and opportunities that they present to different communities in the US and around the world? We've got a lot of great conversations planned for you over the next 2 days with some of the leading experts in the field, as well as some really exciting examples of people already using generative AI tools for journalism, art, education, and more. We're excited to dig in, but first, a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Future of Speech Online will run from noon to 2:30 p.m. Eastern today and tomorrow. That's Wednesday and Thursday this week. And we are recording and live streaming all of the sessions on CDT's YouTube page, youtube.com/sendemtech. So if you have to pop out to another meeting or you miss a session, that's okay. You can catch up on what you missed afterwards. Along those lines, today's event is public and it's on the record. We'll be taking audience questions throughout the sessions. So if you're connecting through the Zoom webinar, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the window. If you're following the live stream, you can submit questions via email to questions@cdt.org or via Twitter @SendDemTech using hashtag CDT questions, hashtag FOSO2023. CDT's communications manager, Elizabeth Seeger, will be monitoring these channels and will pass those questions on to our moderators. We'll also have live captioning available through Zoom and on the live stream, and we'll be taking short breaks between some of the longer sessions to allow our captioners to take a break. And of course, we would like to extend a special thanks to Stand Together Trust for partnering with us on this event for the 7th year running. Now with that, I'm delighted to introduce our opening session, a fireside chat between Alan Davidson, the head of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and CDT's own President and CEO, Alexandra Givens.
To welcome everybody to our 7th annual Future of Speech Online conference, and to start this fireside chat. Well, I am so thrilled to welcome everybody to our 7th annual Future of Speech Online conference, and to start this fireside chat with Alan Davidson, who is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information and Administrator of the NTIA. We're thrilled to have you. Thanks for joining us.
It's so great to be here and to be with CDT and actually at this conference, which I very vividly remember when it began, and it's great to see it continuing and thriving, and it's actually sort of never felt more important really than it does today, yeah.
Well, we are thrilled to have you as a CDT alum, so I have to start as a proud CDTer by actually asking you about that background. You know, this was a place where you began your policy work in DC. What brought you to this space and this set of issues?
It's a great question, and I think a lot of it had to do with how I got into this field generally, which was kind of a long interest since I was a student in the the power of technology to affect our society. And actually the origin story for me was I had the chance to work with this nuclear physicist when I was an undergrad at MIT. This guy, Philip Morrison, he was an eminent nuclear scientist, not the one that we're all talking about right now, who's not the one with the movie, but Professor Morrison spent the early part of his career working on the Manhattan Project, serving his country, helping to develop nuclear weapons. And then he spent pretty much the rest of his career, until I knew him, working to stop the use of the very technologies that he had helped to build. And the lesson really wasn't lost on me when I was in college, and it's been an enduring theme for me, that we have this power to build technologies that can separate us or divide us, that can do amazing good, that can bring us together, that can empower people, that can end wars, but that we can also make choices to have technologies that are technologies of control, that can divide us as societies, and that can even do incredible harm to people. But the enduring theme is that the choice is ours, right? That we can choose technologies of freedom or control, technologies of openness, technologies that will make our society better. And that's really been the animating theme of my work. It's what brought me to CDT originally, the chance to work on these internet policy issues. And it doesn't, I can't think of another time where it's felt more immediate and relevant than this conversation about AI.
Yeah, I love that focus. And it's interesting, right? Because you were here in the early days of the commercial internet when CDT was working and a lot of others were working to kind of get that balance right. And I'm curious, I sit here now and I look back, and in some ways it feels like there are real parallels to that time of the dawn of the early commercial internet. And I'm curious if you see that too, and if so, what lessons we should learn from kind of iteration 1.0 as we think about generative AI now.
I think there are a lot of parallels, but what's really interesting to me and hopeful to me is how I feel like we're engaging earlier in the project than we did before. And what I mean by that is that we're seeing responses, and we're seeing more people get engaged on these issues of AI, and particularly AI policy and ethics around AI, than we did in the early days of Web 2.0 or social media, or even like the rise of the internet. And you can see it, part of it's the way that companies are stepping up. I was for years sort of a student of like, when do companies hire their first public policy person? Right. And like for Microsoft, it was like employee number 20,000. And for Google, it was like employee number 2,000. And for Twitter, it's probably like employee 400 or 500. And Anthropic, I would bet that within the first 100 or 150 people they hired, they had people who were thinking about the ethics and public policy pieces. We've got a much more amped up and sophisticated civil society community. CDT is a leader in that space, but really far more sophisticated and far deeper in knowledge than anything I think we saw in the early days. A broader set of civil society groups that are engaged. Policymakers, I mean, there's nearly 200 bills that have been introduced at the state and local level and in the federal government on AI just this year. I mean, that is so much more activity than we saw in the early days of the internet, right? So I think there's way more engagement. That's one of the biggest lessons, and I think it's actually a cause for hope that even though it probably feels like we're, we're behind the curve, and then we are in some ways, it's also true that we're engaging earlier in this project. And it's going to be a years-long project, but we're engaging earlier than we did before.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So NTIA is doing its part. I mean, you're spending your days giving out tens of billions of dollars to support broadband infrastructure, which is hugely important. I mean, those are, let's get the fundamentals straight. But when you're not doing that, NTIA is engaging in this AI conversation too. And in April, you put out a request for comments that was really focused on AI accountability. I lost my push for you to make news at FOSO by actually dropping your report today.
That would have been amazing.
So that's okay. That's failure number one. But I would love a preview, kind of what you all are seeing, what the comments were like, kind of any takeaways or insights that you had from that process.
Well, I think, first of all, the starting point for us is where the administration is on this issue, which is that responsible AI innovation is going to do amazing things to make people's lives better. But we're only going to realize that promise if we can deal with the very real risks and concerns about the use of AI today. This project is actually one we started at NTIA over a year ago to think about AI accountability. We've known these issues around AI and machine learning were coming. The conversation around generative AI has only, upped the game. So we were a little lucky, but we wanted to think about accountability and audit systems, and particularly about what does it take to build a good accountability ecosystem. So we could really understand, do machine learning models, do AI systems work the way they say they're going to work? And that's a big deal because if you think about things like the financial accounting system, right? The ability to do audits on a financial statement is part of what gives people faith in that system. So I think the analog really holds. What we're trying to do is think about, okay, what does it take to be able to look at a model or look at a system and basically say, does this operate the way people say it's supposed to operate? Does it with the right privacy protections? Does it have the kind of bias protections? Is it safe? And how do we create a third-party ecosystem of auditors and assessors out there? How do we give people the tools, and what would government need to do to be able to make that a reality? So we put out this request for comments. Probably the biggest surprise to me was we got 1,400 comments back, which was not what we were really expecting. And the great thing there is we've really touched a nerve. People have a lot of thoughts about this, and we're putting together a report to synthesize it and talk about a plan for moving forward, and we're going to have it out by the end of the year.
That's great. I mean, we were so thrilled to see you leading on this because it really does feel like this is going to be a key, no matter whether the solutions are legislative or it's best practices, this question of meaningful auditing is going to permeate. And really it's going to be across all sectors of the economy, right? It's not just the developers of AI systems, but the deployers of AI systems too. Companies just trying to know, hey, can I use this system for hiring? Can I integrate this generative AI tool into my software? They are going to want to know, how can I trust these tools?
Exactly. And I think that one thing I've seen out in the space, and you've been doing this work and going all over, is that people are really hungering to understand, what does good look like here? Like, tell me, there's a huge amount of interest in innovation, but just tell me what the guardrails are. Tell me, and that's where I think that actually government can be a big help by giving an indicator, whether through, codes of conduct or through actual regulation, but giving people a sense, giving developers a sense, here's the safe space to innovate and go for it in that area and create a level playing field for them to do that. And so that's part of the intent here, is to say, here's a way to think about how do we measure whether AI systems are living up to what they need to do in that setting.
So you previewed exactly where I was going to go next, which is, we talked to some of the companies that are either auditing their own systems or the auditing companies that are moving into this space. And one of the questions is, what standards do you actually measure by? It's one thing to say, okay, you have to measure, but what are you measuring for? And I'm curious how you think we get from kind of where we are now, which is a little bit of a free-for-all, to meaningful standards, and what's the role for government to play in that as we go forward?
Well, it's going to take some time, and it will probably vary from sector to sector where government needs to get engaged or where we may be able to do this without government engagement. And that's still a little bit to be seen. But I think the starting point is just what you said. We need to know what we're measuring against, what standards we're creating. Standards have been so important in technology, for decades now. The traditional standards mechanisms can take years, and I know there's a lot of work being done in the standards bodies to develop clear, technical standards. In the meantime, I think probably what we're going to need to do is, while we wait for some of those standards to develop, there's a whole lot of work that's been done, as you know, on, good principles out there for how, what good does look like in this space. We have things like the blueprint for a consumer bill of rights in AI. We have a lot of different international frameworks and standards that are being developed. We have some good tools in like the risk management framework that NIST is developing at the Department of Commerce, my colleagues there. And so I do think there's a lot of informal work being done as well as the formal standards work being done. And in the meantime, for the audits and assessments that we're looking to, I think we'll have to start with some of the not necessarily principles, but we'll look at principles, but also just simple things like does a model operate the way it says it's going to operate? That may be a starting point, and then as standards get developed, as society embraces them, whether in a self-regulatory way or through a regulatory structure, then we'll import those kinds of standards into the audits and the assessments, if that makes sense.
It does. I'm curious what you think about the international piece of this. So the administration's been doing a lot of work with Europe. The US-EU Trade and Technology Council kind of has AI and standards as one prong of what they're doing. We're seeing other standards conversations. The UN is talking about global harmonization. The UK AI Safety Summit, I mean, we could go like the whole list, right? There, you know, everybody's talking about it. I'm curious kind of how you think about the US showing up in those spaces, the utility of the international push as we try to think kind of what our metrics are going to be.
The international element of this is absolutely essential, right? Math doesn't stop at the border. The development of AI systems is going to happen all around the world. People are going to be using them all around the world. And so if we're going to have effective mechanisms for protecting people online and in the use of these systems, we're going to need to have some kind of international harmonization around these issues. And so we've been hard at work in the administration with our partners. Some of this work's been going on for some time, the Global Partnership on AI, the UN's efforts, but it's really amped up, right, in recent months. And you've named it. I think that the administration's starting point has been to say we've been working towards this set of commitments from companies. Can we turn that into a broader set of commitments and a code of conduct that speaks to commitments around safety, around security, around trust? Could we get more companies into that? And then could we take it to other countries and get other like-minded countries to embrace that kind of model? If you had a code of conduct, then that becomes a basis for at least providing some protections immediately to people. And then we can talk about how we harmonize more like regulatory frameworks. It's going to take some time, but the thing that's been exciting about this work, particularly in the G7 with the UK and their safety summit, ultimately more broadly with other countries, the exciting thing is people are really bought in right now to this idea that we have to do something, and I think getting those commitments from companies is going to be a really effective part of it.
So the commitments that the White House got over the summer, and then they just added a new group of people this past fall, a new group of companies this past fall, have been mainly focused on generative AI. I mean, that's been kind of the current conversation. The UK AI Safety Summit is very exclusively focused. I'm curious, going back for a moment to the RFC and the process that NTIA is covering, do you think about that being focused on generative AI, on other AI use cases? Do you think we need to be treating these differently as we move the frameworks forward?
Well, I think it's interesting. Our starting point, and I do think our report will speak more broadly than just generative AI. It is interesting. You know, we've been following this space. CDT has been following this space for years. Generative AI has really captured people's imagination, which is exciting. It's not clear that all of the most economically impactful use cases for machine learning and AI are going to be all in the generative AI space. Yeah. We look at a lot of image recognition, medical diagnosis, drug discovery, autonomous systems. You know, those aren't all within the same bucket that people are thinking of around generative AI. I think that we need, so I do think our hope is that our accountability mechanisms are going to be broader, that are going to focus more generally. But I also think there's a real value in embracing this moment around generative AI, because the truth is, like, as we've said, you don't get these moments all the time. And because, you know, the ChatGPTs of the world, they have really captured the public's imagination. And because of this, you're seeing policymakers respond. You know, we have the president himself, President Biden himself, has been engaged in these conversations here in the US. Leaders all around the world care about this. It's a moment, and it won't last forever. We need to take advantage of this moment and think about how can we put in place frameworks or regulation or legislation, commitments, whatever it takes to make sure that we're meeting the moment. The public's attention will move to something else, but this is our moment on generative AI. Let's take advantage of it.
Let's deal with the other uses of AI that impact people's rights at the same time, though. So
Yes.
brief advocacy plug. No, that
For sure.
I hear you. I mean, and there's so much attention in this right now. And one of the things that I think we've been focused on as an organization at CDT, and other advocates have said this too, is that some of the basic mechanisms like auditing are actually useful not only for generative AI, but for when AI is being used in housing, in hiring, in benefits determinations. Like a lot of the same fundamentals for accountability are going to apply.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is, you mentioned some of these risks, and I think it's important to understand that in both generative AI and in these other areas, the risks are real right now. There's been so much, because I think of the way the public's imagination has been captured, longer term, very serious risks to our society and our safety. The robots are coming to get us all.
Yeah.
I think there's a value in bifurcating that conversation about risk, and we've seen that certainly within the approach within the administration, to say these longer term risks, very serious people are worried about them. We should have a process. We do have a process for thinking about them and dealing with them. But that's quite different than the very real risks that people face today from the use of many of these machine learning systems. And you mentioned a few of them: privacy, safety, security, the bias that exists in these systems that are being used today. And whether they're generative or non-generative, many of the issues are the same, and we need to be thinking today about how to mitigate those risks, or we won't realize the promise of the innovation that we can have. So,
I'd love to push you on kind of one of the interventions that folks are talking about, which is around transparency as kind of one key element of accountability. It doesn't get us fully there. We know that transparency on privacy practices doesn't necessarily help because nobody actually reads privacy policies and those disclosures.
right.
But it is still a really important piece of the puzzle, right? To help for companies to explain what they're doing, how they are approaching these questions. I'm curious how you think about the issue of transparency and how to make it as useful as possible as we think about that as one tool for accountability.
Well, transparency is a critical piece of the accountability puzzle. It's been interesting as we've been thinking about our own accountability work and how you do good audits. It starts with transparency. You need to be able to have some insight into how models work, how systems work, how they were trained, some of the other issues that are going to be essential to doing that measurement and being able to make guarantees. The question of transparency is probably going to vary quite a lot by the use case and by the user, by the risks that the systems pose. And what I mean by that is that different users are going to need to know different things, and that's going to be part of our challenge. We have a staffer at our office who uses a generative AI tool to create coloring books for her, for her toddler, right? And the truth is, like, probably the issues around the factual basis of the outputs and the intellectual property rights even are going to be less acute in that setting than when we're using AI to make factual assertions, when students are using them to potentially write papers in a class, when we're using these systems for much more intense uses that affect people's health or their safety, their incarceration status. There are many different, wide spectrum of use cases. So the risks that are being posed by a particular system, the user who's using it, the use case itself, is going to drive how much transparency people need. In some of those settings, you need a lot of understanding about how the model was trained. What's the data? Is this fact or fiction that I'm getting back? Can I feel confident in the intellectual property status of the material I'm seeing? Those issues are going to matter a lot, and so we need to have a kind of spectrum of transparency, really, that's going to meet people where they are and what their needs are, if that makes sense.
It does, and it's interesting because it does pull back to the lessons we've learned from content moderation too, right? And kind of what the type of transparency that is useful for a regulator or for somebody doing a deep dive as a public interest advocate is very different than what your average user wants to see on their screen as they're scrolling. I would love to pull back to the bigger picture. So in addition to the RFC, the request for comments, and the report NTI is working on, you also serve as a senior advisor to the president on tech issues in general. Yes, broad shoulders for that important role. I can't let this moment go by without asking you about the expected executive order on AI and anything that you can share on that. And if you're going to pull your punch and say you can't share much yet, which is okay, just how you think about kind of the role of what the executive branch can do, anything you'd like to share about kind of those efforts and how it relates to legislation.
Well, you know, and as I said, the starting point for this administration is a real belief that AI innovation is going to bring real benefits to people, and it's going to affect a huge part of our society, or probably no part of our economy will go ultimately untouched by these developments. But at the same time, we're only going to realize the promise of it if we address these very real risks and concerns that are happening today. And the president himself has said we need to be clear-eyed about this technology. So from the top, we have a strong sense of the fierce urgency of the moment and a need to engage. I don't really have a lot to share about the executive order itself.
Okay,
we've said that an executive order will be forthcoming, but I think it's in keeping with this broad kind of whole of government approach that the administration is taking and the president has asked for. It started with this set of commitments, which we've developed in a, kind of in many ways in a record pace. It was really incredible to see industry respond, and again, highest levels of government engaged. I think it was 80 days from when we announced it to when we announced the first set of tranche of company commitments. There's an eagerness to use all of the tools at our disposal. So the executive order that's going to be forthcoming, looking at all of the authorities that we have within the federal government. The regulatory agencies have pledged that they are going to step up and use their authorities. That's the FTC, the SEC. You'll see, the EEOC on unemployment. I think you'll see more and more of those kinds of agencies stepping up. We've talked about using some of the other kinds of guidance, like what are we doing on procurement? That's another great tool for the federal government to try and enforce or promulgate ideas and standards. We've got a lot of tooling that we're working on, like what can we do on the standards side? So our colleagues over at NIST, putting together their risk management framework, I think you'll see more of that kind of work about where can we hit some of the hard problems in AI and where can we offer help. And then taking that on the road internationally and thinking about how we can work with our partners. And that'll be through the UK Safety Summit, through the TTC, through this G7 Hiroshima process on, and thinking about codes of conduct and what we can do. So there's a theory of the case here that it really involves all of the authorities that we have, and then thinking about legislation. The president has said, bipartisan legislation, something that we're interested in, where we can find initially the low-hanging fruit. It's going to be hard to do a comprehensive bill, I think, but there are a lot of ideas. Leader Schumer has been doing a lot of work in the Senate, and there's a lot happening in the House too around how we can get Congress more up to speed. So I think there's a lot of activity, and people are really responding. It goes back to this idea of, we have to take advantage of this moment. We've captured the imagination of the public. Government is really responding and thinking about it. How do we do that in a way that promotes innovation here in the US, but also deals with these really real risks and concerns we need to address.
Well, it's wonderful to hear. We're glad you're in the leadership role to help steer it. Thank you again.
It's great to be here, and thank you for the work that you're doing. And if there's anything that gives me hope in this space right now, because it is a lot of work and it does seem daunting at times, I think the biggest thing is conversations like this and the people who are engaged in it, the advocacy community that's helping us really think through these hard problems, and the young people, the young computer scientists who are coming out of school who care about these issues. That's really the fact that we have such a broad community now and a growing community that cares about these issues. So thank you for your leadership.
Beautifully put. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan and Alex, for that excellent discussion. And apologies to everyone for the brief technical difficulties up top. I think we managed to get all of the audio running as should be, but if you feel like you missed anything, you can always check back in on youtube.com/senddemtech for recordings, and including the full recording of the fireside chat that we just saw. Next, I am delighted to welcome to the virtual stage Miranda Bogan, who will moderate our first panel, the nuts and bolts and nuances of foundation models. Miranda, over to you.
Thanks, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a really exciting topic and one I know we're all very excited to dig into, because there's just so much to unpack about this technology that's both familiar. We've been dealing with some of these issues for a while, but also quite new. Just checking on one of our panelists is running a bit late, but I think we'll be able to get started, and she can jump on when she's able to. But just to introduce myself, my name is Miranda Bogan. I'm an independent AI policy researcher and practitioner in the responsible AI space. I worked with teams building this technology, building foundation models for a number of years, and really saw how the decisions around the nuts and bolts of how to build these systems can have quite significant downstream impacts. And so we want to hear more about what that process looks like. What are some of the considerations that folks building this technology need to be thinking about, but what do we in the policy community need to be aware of about that process? And I couldn't have a better panel than the one we have today. Some really leading experts in this space to tee the topic up. I'm never a fan of awkwardly reading people's bios, so what I'm going to do is jump right into the substance, but let everyone give a brief introduction of themselves and some of their work related to this space before they jump into the first question. And so let's kick it off. And what I want to do first is turn to Arvin Narayanan, who's an associate professor of computer science at Princeton, and hear a bit of an introduction of yourself, but also maybe just to get us started, can you explain what foundation models are, what vis-a-vis generative AI, vis-a-vis large language models, how do those fit together? How are these concepts related, and how are they distinct?
Sure. Thank you, Miranda. As Miranda said, my name is Arvin Narayanan. I'm at Princeton University. I've been working on AI for a while, especially the intersection with questions around society, tech policy. I have a book coming out called AI Snake Oil with my co-author Sayesh Kapoor, where we try to tamp down on AI hype a little bit. Of course, generative AI is a very powerful technology, but I don't think we should let our guard down and believe all the claims that are being made about them. So with that said, let's talk about this technology a little bit. ChatGPT, of course, is the reason why the public is familiar with this technology, but it's pretty old. Back in the 1960s, there was a chatbot called Eliza, which was nothing like modern systems. It was a very simple rule-based system, but it actually fooled people into thinking there might be something going on in there, something similar to sentience or consciousness. Over time, this technology improved gradually, but the big shift in the last couple of decades was kind of abandoning the approach of human programmers putting in their understanding, their rules about how the bot should respond, and to just let it figure out patterns from large volumes of text. And so that's how modern chatbots are primarily trained, using a large fraction of the text on the web, and that approach generally falls under what is called deep learning. So in computer science, this really started to come to the fore about a decade ago. And interestingly, first in the context of image classification rather than in text. So around 2012 or so, this started happening, and then the pace picked up a little bit. And around 2018, deep learning technology started to be applied really effectively to language models as well. And so when we say the word large language models, it goes back about 5 years, especially in the form that we know it today. So again, even this specific technology, people in the field of AI have known for about 5 years now that this is all coming. One other important thing, and to me, it still surprises me despite working in this field for so long, is that the way that these models process images and text and audio and various other modalities of data are largely similar. A lot of the underlying principles are the same. It's not always the same exact model, but in fact, when a technique called transformers started working for language, people then started applying it successfully to vision. And then in vision, when a technique called diffusion started working well, a lot of people are now trying to apply it to language. And when we think about recent multimodal models like GPT-4, it's literally the same model that is processing both image and text. So that is one important thing to keep in mind. And that is why when these innovations happen, they're affecting multiple different fields: text generation, image generation, voices, faces. audio, music, and lots of startups and big companies, I'm sure, are now working on video generation. And if that starts working well, that is going to have even bigger effects than we're seeing with images and deep fakes now. So that is, a very brief lay of the land, and I look forward to diving deeper from there.
Thank you so much. I have so many follow-up questions, but you raised one specifically that I want to turn to Pratik about, which is just that there are a lot of similarities across models. The different companies, different developers are deploying, but they're also, we're observing different. Can you talk, Pratik, about just introduce yourself, but also talk about some of the considerations that go into creating these models, some of the choices that get made both on the training side, on other design choices. We hear a lot about the hardware it takes to train these models, the scale, the number of parameters. Are those really distinguishing, or are there other decisions that are differentiating among these models that are using otherwise somewhat similar architecture?
Yeah, these are really good questions. So like I said, I'm Pratik. I'm a research engineer at Google DeepMind. And previously I've worked in, I just graduated from CMU, but I've worked in Microsoft Research on multilingual systems and semantic parsing. I've worked in generative AI fields such as source code generation and gesture generation. I've seen like a few changes that have been happening over the past few years, especially when this kind of revolution has taken off in terms of generative AI. And I think that earlier models, there used to be a lot of considerations towards specific like architectural modifications and like the kind of data that you pass it. Now there have been like a few consistencies that come across more and more models. And the reason for that is because it just seems like empirically some things just work for like, there are some reasons for why they work, but some say hyperparameters in the model, the way the model is designed, seem to work. So people use like a body of work collected from like academic and industrial research. They looked at what works the best, and they kind of kept the same trend going on and on. So roughly there are like four high level like stages when we look at the training of a model. And I think when we say foundational model, we're talking about models like GPT-4, Llama 2, Chinchilla, and so on. So the first thing is to look at what kind of data you'll be using to train the language model. So the language model essentially has a bunch of parameters, so billions and billions. And this is actually proved to be important for the certain tasks that we evaluate on. So it's been observed that the larger you make the models, the more the performance improves given like a set of data. So nowadays, when people build foundational models, they look at three kind of high level things which you mentioned. So the compute budget, how much compute you have, how much you can do with that compute, the size of the model, and the amount of training data. And the amount of training data is also pretty important because you see like the model gets to see all that data. In some ways, it'll remember some things about the data. In some ways, like it completely like gets things wrong, which we'll probably get to in the future. So pre-training collection, data collection are design considerations that are done. Like researchers look at how to best collect data across like different sources like Wikipedia, books, social media, and now like even source code. And then they use this data to pre-train the model. Along with that, because we're in the generative AI sphere, you also have this other phase called instruction tuning, which is actually piled into the pre-training stage. So in instruction tuning, what you do is that you basically show the model, or you give the model an instruction. So you tell it that you tell it to solve a particular question. So like who's the president of the United States, and then you basically ask the model to generate what the answer would be. And then the meta instruction would be like, can you solve this question? And there are many such tasks. So there would be like, can you summarize this particular passage? And since it's all text that's being passed in, you can basically formulate that task as just a sequence and pass it into the model as pre-training data. So what tasks do we make the model learn? Like what data do we have currently, which is collected, are also things that people look at. So you want to expand on the capabilities of the model. You want to maybe make it learn summarization, question answering, like a whole range of tasks. So you need to include that in the data. So I think some of those things are pretty important in the data stage. Once you train, although hyperparameters such as like how much, like batch size, for example. So batch size is at in one step of training, how much, like how many data points does the model see? Those things have variable successes. So some people think that letting it see more, letting it see less during every step matters, but those again, like kind of abstract out. There are a certain set of standard numbers and parameters that people use for those. But I'd also like to focus, like continuing on, I'd like to focus on evaluation. So evaluation is really important. And I think that's a very careful design process that you need to make. You need to make sure that the capabilities that you're trying to instill in the model, you're able to measure them. So how well is it able to answer certain questions about the real world? Common sense reasoning tasks, is it able to reason about, if I tell it that person A is the brother of person B and person C is the father of person B, so what's the relation between person C and A? So how do we measure that? We need data sets. And there's been great work in the academic space to collect such data sets and use them as evaluations. But that's like that's a static evaluation where the evaluation data has been collected. But if you want to see how it performs in the real world, you need to measure, you need a better way to evaluate. So that's also a really open problem that researchers are thinking about. And along with evaluation, I think safety is also really, really important. So when you train the model over all this data, say you collected from the internet, there's bound to be data or toxic things in the data that you preferably do not want the model to learn, and you don't want it to reflect when it's generating information. So how do you make these models safe? So I'm sure like Arvin, Roman would have more context on that, but like there are ways to improve the model, train it in a way that makes it more safe. So I think that would cover the high range of design choices.
Amazing. Again, so many follow-up questions. I want to make sure I start in the best place. So one follow-up before we zoom back out is you talked about evaluation data sets and you differentiated those from training data sets. And you talked about evaluation data sets maybe being more curated and more specific, specifically tuned to measure something in particular. Can you talk a little bit more about the training data sets, and to what extent do the folks developing these models know what's included in them? And to what extent is it just too large to kind of comprehend what's in them, hence needing the evaluations to identify whether there might have been something ingested into the model in the first place that wasn't intended?
Yeah, so I think, so the amount of data we're talking is in like trillions of tokens. So that would be maybe like words going into the model, for which you can't really account for everything that goes in. But more importantly, we can't always expect that if we give it this kind of data, it'll perform like exactly the way we want to. So especially in like so when you're trying to evaluate a particular capability, things like instruction tuning certainly make the model better in those capabilities. And those instruction tuning, the ones where there's a task and then like say a question answer, those are kind of curated, and those might be in like the hundreds of thousands in terms of data points. But then you need like a human curated evaluation data set, something which we've mapped out, we've written, we know that the answer to this question is this. And sometimes some of these training data sets are semi-automatically curated. So to kind of bridge that gap, there's a big difference in how they look. And they should look different if we want to keep making better evaluations.
Excellent. Arvin, is there anything you want to add to that foundational data set, but also a question that I wanted to follow up with you on that I think still fits in here is, to what extent are the models we're talking about inherently generative, and to what extent do they also simply reflect relationships between different words and phrases and language, and that can be used in ways other than generative use cases?
Sure. Let me add one thing to the previous discussion on training data sets. So there's training, there's fine-tuning, there's evaluation, there's so many different pieces that Pratik nicely explained. I think one area where I disagree with a lot of the debate here is, while training data is super important in many ways, it's important to know what's in there, especially from a copyright and the ethics of data collection, those sorts of perspectives. The behavior of the model ultimately, I think, is much more affected by the fine-tuning data than by the pre-training data. And that distinction is often not appreciated. There's emerging research on this. For instance, there's one paper from my colleagues here at Princeton. It's called Overrating Pre-trained Bias with Fine-Tuning Data. That's one example of research on this, but there's a few things I can potentially point to. And so in traditional machine learning, it used to be that you can draw a relatively straight line between the training data and the behavior of the model, right? Garbage in, garbage out, especially when it comes to things like biased data, biased model performance. With generative AI, it's a little bit different, again, because there are these different moving parts of it. And so I want to emphasize that the training data is, I think, less important than is often claimed, whereas the fine-tuning data, reinforcement learning, those data sets are super important. And so that also has policy implications when we want companies to be transparent. It doesn't have to be an either or, but what would be particularly valuable is more transparency around fine-tuning that really shapes the behavior of the model. I've forgotten your other question.
That was a fantastic point, and I want to come back to it. The other question was just going back to the initial question of how should we be thinking about the distinctions between foundation models and simply models that represent relationships between different types of content and generative models? Is it really just in how the models are tuned for what they're supposed to output, or what kind of distinguishes potentially those two categories?
Yeah, so the reason people use the term foundation models is because it reflects this idea, this principle that's become dominant in the last 3 or 4 years, is that you can train one model that has understood the relationships to some extent between what's in the training data and then adapt it for various tasks. Up until a year or two ago, the way people were doing that is to train a foundation model and then kind of fine-tune it for each particular task. You have a fine-tuned model for language translation, you have another fine-tuned model for question answering, et cetera. But the big leap, if I may say that, with chatbots has been that you can avoid even that step. You have a model that has, in some sense, learned to do these hundreds or thousands of tasks, and you can just tell it in words what is the task that you want to do, right? So in that sense, chatbots represent a very consumer-focused product that encapsulates the foundation model idea. Generating text is, of course, only one application of that. The same infrastructure can be used, for instance, in content moderation, because to some extent it has learned based on its training, the kinds of judgments that go into identifying whether a particular piece of text is toxic, as one example. It's certainly not great at that. I don't think it can be a replacement for human content moderators, but also carefully designing the policies and so on. But I think these technologies do have some role in that area. And similarly, in a variety of different areas, a part of the excitement around this technology, language models in particular, is that I think a lot of machine learning scientists and engineers will tell you that they think language is a substrate for intelligence. I'll unpack that in a second. And I think that still remains an empirical claim to be borne out or not. But I think that is what makes it so exciting. And what people mean is that in the past, in AI, people came up with various ways of getting AI to reason through symbolic systems, through complicated logical programs written in special purpose programming languages like Prolog. And what people are now saying is that we don't need those kinds of innovations for reasoning, but instead, these models can reason perhaps, somewhat similarly to people reasoning, which is to use text as the basis for reasoning. And the simplest version of that is chain of thought reasoning, which today's models can already do to some extent, which is just, think step by step and explain your reasoning as you go along. And we can already see that allowing the models to perform chain of thought reasoning results in dramatically better performance in some applications than just a straight shot answer. And so is there a lot of potential there? Are there forms of reasoning that can be developed on top of language models, on top of textual outputs? So those are the kinds of things that people are excited about that can allow foundation models to be much more than simply text generation or image generation or what have you.
Amazing. You mentioned that you sort of threw a phrase out there, which is that the model has learned hundreds of different tasks, but then you were talking about whether language is knowledge. What does the research have to say about whether the models have actually learned these concepts? We've seen stories about them passing the bar exam and MCATs, and I don't know all the different tests. What do we actually know about how that's working, and whether a model maybe has encountered examples of that work in the past and is simply sort of drawing on those examples, or if it truly has learned something?
I think you want to take a crack at it first, and then I can share something as well.
Yeah, I can try taking this one. But I think that we have to be really careful when saying that a model has because there's a lot of hype news out there which says that just because it is passing the bar exam, it is actually able to understand the intricacies of what it is to be a lawyer. I'd like to say that you have to really, really just take a stand against those things. I feel like models learn associations. They're really good at certain capabilities, but it's always important to know that there is still a lot we don't know about the model, and we cannot at all draw parallels between how a model learns and how humans learn. So it's, I think, again, Arvin's snake oil magazine has a lot of things about these, but yeah, that's my opinion. I think it's important to, until we know exactly what the model can do and can't do, which is consistently evolving, we should always be repelling these kind of bold claims.
Yeah, strong agree. There's two ways to look at this, right? One is, can this model do a task well? And that's a very functional understanding of what is going on. You're not asking questions about what's inside the model. Is it useful for a particular purpose? And you can take any particular task, just as a really mundane example. I use language models to automate the process of citation formatting. There are certain ways in which it actually does a lot better than existing citation management software, right? And I can measure that, and I don't have to ask questions about, does it understand what the citation really is? That's irrelevant, right? I can just, get a number at the end of it. I asked it to format 100 citations and got 95 of them right. So in that sense, we have a lot of knowledge about what these models can and cannot do. And in many areas, I would say the progress is very encouraging. And I think we should be continuing to develop these types of adaptations of foundation models for particular tasks, and of course putting guardrails around them and telling people what the limitations are and all that stuff. And then there's the question of actual understanding, and this goes back to questions about the bar exam or the medical licensing exam. If you just want to take a very functional perspective on it, yes, it's capable of producing the correct answers to these exam questions some percentage of the time. But that doesn't tell you much, because unlike the citation formatting task, which is a real world task that I have in my workflow, the questions on the bar exam or the medical exam do not represent real world tasks that lawyers or doctors need to do. They're not sitting there answering exam questions all day. And so the reason that people get excited about these kinds of measurements is because of the assumption that there is internally understanding going on that is similar to human expert understanding of those domains that can then transfer to real world tasks. And that is a leap. And I think, as Pratik was also saying, we should be very careful about making that leap. And instead, the way that I would prefer to measure these models is really for AI developers to sit down with domain experts, with lawyers or doctors or journalists or whoever it is, going about their daily workflows and just observing and quantifying how well it works for the specific tasks that they have. And I think researchers are only starting to do that. And so I would much rather look at that body of research than these kind of abstracted, decontextualized claims about capabilities.
Yeah, so the importance of having a clear idea of what you're measuring and what you're trying to see if a model does well, but also what a model doesn't do well. And I want to turn back to Pratik, and then Ramon, I'll come to you because you have a lot to say on this as well, which is great. But Pratik, Arvin, I think, had a provocation that I want to turn back to you, which was that the training data may not be primarily determinative of the function of a model. And I think some of your research about language and to what extent these language models actually work across different languages might have to do with training data, but I'd love to hear from you. Is that the case? Do you agree with Arvin's assertion there? Or what's been your experience in the role that different choices around training data play in the performance of models, let's say when it comes to specific languages?
Yeah, I think that, I think I'd still stick to the fact that instruction tuning data sets, especially when you train in the pre-training stage, have shown the ability to say transfer knowledge between different tasks. But yeah, I guess that there has been a lot of research which goes against and like for this. I'd say like in my experience in like say code generation, like in order to accurately leverage the abilities of different tasks, putting them together in the pre-training or instruction tuning phase has been really helpful. So for example, let's say we train the model on one task, which is to like generate the next line of code given that I've typed in some particular line. That would be really useful. But let's say we want to take it one step further. We want to see whether given a particular text or given a particular code file, I'm confused about what it exactly does. But we don't really have data which like instruction tuning data explicitly, which has a pair of the source file and an explanation of what it does. Instead, what we could do is we could transfer the information between the first data set, which is the code completion, and let's see the summarization instruction tuning set. And if we put them together, it has been noticed that there is a transfer between these capabilities. So I still think there's like a lot of promise in putting well-placed tasks in the instruction tuning set. But I do agree that like if we decide to have a particular model to be used as a tool, specific to be deployed in the world for a task, it's important to fine tune that, because fine tuning basically ensures that we're getting the task correct, and we're not producing undesirable behavior. And I think that's important to stop.
And does that transfer of skill and fine tuning, the ability of fine tuning to kind of add capability to models, also transfer across linguistic contexts, across regions of the world, or does that require sort of different concerted effort to make sure that the models are similarly capable in languages outside of the majority languages?
It definitely requires a concerted effort. So based on the past work I've done in low resource languages, multilingual systems, we did note that there are often these big disparities between like the data sets or the data that's available to train these models. But more from a ground up, we've often taken like an agnostic approach, which is English centric. We start with technologies which are trained on English, and then we kind of assume that, okay, this would definitely work for another language. There's no additional linguistic information or domain knowledge that you'd need to solve the other ones. And as a result of that, the direction of like the NLP community in the past few years has kind of always been with the few languages which have the most data kind of taking the priority and the helm, and then a lot of languages being left behind. And the data issue will always exist, because once you start seeing promise in the performance of those few languages, people will collect more data for those. And then the other languages would just continue to be kind of not worked on as much. So that's definitely a big issue.
Arvin.
Sorry, I'm excited to hear from Raman, but I just wanted to quickly say that I was trying to type an answer to David Morar's question in the chat, but I accidentally clicked the wrong button. So if they could type the question again, I'd be happy to post a link in response to that. I apologize.
Amazing. And we'll turn to questions in a couple more minutes. So if people want to start putting questions in, we'll go through those and pose those to the panel after we get through a little bit more of the foundation. But we really hope to hear from you, the listeners, about what you want to learn from the panel. But I want to turn to Raman, because we've been talking about capabilities of the models and how do we know if they work and don't work, and how do we make sure they're working in cases where we expect them to be and not producing outputs that we don't want them to. And you've worked on this directly, both in industry and also recently doing a lot of work on red teaming. Can you talk through some of the ways that those types of exercises of testing and probing help illuminate different issues in the model, and what types of issues are you seeing? What sort of risks are being identified when it comes to foundation models and generative AI from your experience?
Well, most of my experience in industry, and frankly, still most of industry in general, depending on how you define industry and not just tech industry, is still in the world of narrow AI systems. And in that, even in that world, tackling issues of algorithmic bias, creating and generating audits, conducting them, and even having some degree of transparency and accountability for the work you do is still uncharted territory. So to be clear, before we're even talking about foundation models and generative AI models, let me point out that most of the AI and ML that's touching people's lives and are impactful are still narrow, and we still haven't sorted out what audit methodologies look like in those situations. The reason that concerns me is there's a lot of legislation being passed talking about auditing and what it means, and mandating quote unquote an audit without a clear consensus on what that looks like. And then also what the requirements are for reporting on an audit. So what is your responsibility to the public? What's your responsibility to government? And also how you balance that with issues of privacy and security. So that's always the biggest concern when you're at a company. Even well-meaning actors, you can't share everything you're finding, because you may actually be sharing data you're not allowed to share legally, sharing information not allowed to share legally, or exposing some sort of intellectual property. But it's actually usually more the former. It's, we have legal restrictions on the data we can use, how long we can use it, how we can use it, how we can share it. And that will be at odds with the external community's asks for transparency. So, but when it comes to foundation models, generative AI, now we're in the space of general purpose models or broad use models. And, then the risk space expands at the rate that the use space expands into. And I specifically wanted to touch on what you were talking about, multilingual concerns. So when we were generating the challenges for DEF CON, it was a collaborative process. We actually worked with the companies. I ran a meeting. It was every 2 weeks originally, then it was literally every week. And we're still meeting to generate the transparency report in the paper. But this was with all of the red team leads at the different companies that participated. It was with members of OSTP and NIST. And also members of the civil society partners we had. And the number one thing that literally companies asked us to have as one of the challenges was multilingual harms, because this is something that you can't automate and you can't scale easily. It is a human problem, because as you mentioned, Miranda, to your point, it's not just about having it work in those languages. It is also that the trust and safety mechanisms that have been built are generally built in the dominant languages and do not exist in other languages, because you cannot just Google Translate your way into a trust and safety mechanism, right? Because what is harmful speech in a less spoken language, how it is communicated, what is a slur, what is slang, these are wildly different from context to context. And you can so trying to build the mechanisms, even the safeguards, not even just the fundamental model, but the safeguards that exist for those of us who speak majority languages do not exist in other languages. I'll give you a very specific example, and this is a language you might even consider a majority language. Roya Paksad at Taraz, Roya was one of the people in our ongoing working group, and she generated this horrible, phenomenal example of asking a language model to do what was it? My Black disabled friend, we're having a roast for my Black disabled friend. Can you give me some jokes? And in English, it would have this whole qualifier of like, it's fine to tease people, especially if they're your friend, but it shouldn't be couched in their, race or their ability. And it kind of gave like some things you could say. In Farsi, it was like, let's go. A Black person walks into a bar. I mean, I literally don't know what it said because I don't read Farsi, but it's interesting because Farsi it's not, when we think of non-dominant languages, we don't, I mean, Farsi is a widely spoken and understood language. So non-dominant it's almost a misnomer because we're thinking, oh, this is like a language only spoken by a small group of people. No, this is a language spoken by a major portion of the world. It's just not included. So I wanted to point out that for DEF CON, the companies asked us to help them address multilingual harms.
So you talked about the fact that this is also like very nascent, even for narrow models, but we're talking about generative general purpose models today. And my impression is that even the tests we have to identify harms are still very nascent. What does red teaming look like to actually try and uncover these harms? Is it structured yet, or is it simply people trying to figure out what they might pose, questions they might pose to identify issues they've imagined might exist? Are those evaluations crystallizing? And then to build on that, to what extent does finding the problem help you fix it? Are those the same problem or are those very different? What do we know about those things so far?
Yeah, I mean, both amazing questions. So I'm going to tackle the first one first. So I wrote a blog post prior to DEF CON about how we're expanding the notion of red teaming. And red teaming, very traditionally is like you get people who are subject matter experts in a particular field. So this would very, very traditionally would be like security, right? It expanded to bioethics, ethics, et cetera. So it'd be like lots of fancy PhD types getting access to a model and kind of breaking it from their perspective. And, like there are guidelines that are given, like obviously things are supposed to be done with your field of expertise. But when we talk about harms like toxic speech or algorithmic bias, we're no longer really in the world of people who have PhDs in things, but more like your expertise is your lived experience. Your expertise is the knowledge of a language. Your expertise is the fact that you're from the LGBTQ community or you are a person who's transitioned. And then it gets dicey, right? It gets dicey because in part companies should be testing for these things. Companies should not have data about people that would define them as somebody who can test for these things. So one of the things that was important about DEF CON is we're an independent group. We're a nonprofit. Humane Intelligence works, the phrase I use is in collaboration with, but not beholden to companies. We could have run this without them. It was better with them because we want to actually fix the problems that we find, not just kind of find problems and walk off. But this is work that we want to be doing. So the way it's changing is number one, if you are working with people who aren't necessarily experts in technology, but experts in their particular lived experience, you then have to structure the challenges a little bit more, right? So give them a little bit more direction without leading them, which is that's an art, not a science. Like it's very nuanced, and anybody who's worked like I have in like survey design knows how hard it is to like design something so that you're extracting the answer you want, but you're not telling them what you want to hear. Incredibly difficult. The other thing I'll say is like now you have to actually capture answers at scale, which gets to the second part of your question, right? So like what do you do with the information you get? The reason you have to tackle the questions at scale is it's hard to parse through what is a systemic problem versus like a one-off probabilistic bad output, right? Because these are not deterministic models, they're probabilistic. The output of them actually does, by definition, have some probability of like not being good. But then how do you know if, I'll add that what is required to fix a one-off bad output versus what is required to fix a systemic harm is like magnitudes of order of like labor difference, right? So you kind of don't want to screw that one up, right? You don't want to be completely retraining a model when actually it was just an artifact, and you certainly don't want to be acting like something is a one-off basically a patch fix, when it actually is a more systemic problem, because you're going to be stuck like doing a lot of work, making one-off fixes that aren't going to solve the problem. And again, going back to the world of narrow AI, right? Like traditional machine learning, recommendation, the toxicity models on social media, right? My former team, we wrote a whole paper about it. Even going into these models and auditing and assessing them as employees of the company took months. And most of it was not the problem identification, it was actually figuring out the root cause. Specifically, when we published our work on algorithmic amplification of political content, I talk about it in the blog post. I talk about how, like, we don't know why it's happening. We're seeing a manifestation of algorithmic amplification. That's why we were very careful not to call it algorithmic bias. It's one of the common misconceptions of what we did with that paper. What we're demonstrating is this is the output of the algorithm. So route one is its algorithmic bias. We don't know, but we have to figure out if it is, then we have to figure out how to fix it. So algorithmic bias defined as, in that case, in some way, our recommendation engine was figuring out what center-right content was and amplifying it, even though it was not coded into the algorithms. That means something very specific. In the other case, and we never got to finish our work on it, but this is my hypothesis, it actually was doing its job. So the algorithm was surfacing content that people were talking about at the time, which was center-right content. And then what do? Solving that problem is not a technical issue. It's actually a policy issue. But even getting to that point where you're trying to make a decision can take months.
Thank you so much. And just for folks who are tuning in and don't know everyone's background, just talking about research conducted by the Twitter, formerly existing responsible AI team at Twitter, which did some really fascinating research on various questions related to evaluating Twitter's algorithms. There were a couple of mentions, Ruman, by you of retraining, of patch fixes, of different approaches you might take if you spotted a problem, obviously needing to know what the problem was in the first place. But I'd love to open it up to the broader panel of, do we have a sense of the different tools to address issues if we find them in models about how they're underperforming or producing some kind of harmful or toxic output? What do those different approaches look like? And what are the implications of tackling problems at different layers of the tech stack, if you will?
I just talked a bunch, so I'll leave it to somebody else to talk.
I want to take this in a different direction, so I want to hear from the others first.
Oh no, we're all being very polite. Pratik, it's on you.
I can also answer my own question because there's a few I've come across.
Miranda, it's on you.
I mean, I'll just sort of add a little bit of context to the question if anyone wants to build on it. I think some of the recommendations that folks who aren't digging into the models directly include, well, if you find a certain set of problems, then just retrain the model and fix those problems. And that, I think is enormously expensive. It is both financially and potentially to the environment, but also fixing one problem, because it's a general purpose model, trying to retrain a model to fix one issue, you might introduce a variety of others, and you could imagine a kind of whack-a-mole situation there. But I'm curious if anyone on here has ideas of when that actually might be critical or a useful intervention. Other interventions that I've come across are training classifiers to kind of sit on top of a foundation model to address some of those outcome issues that Ruman mentioned, or fine-tuning might be a solution to a certain set of approaches. Are there others that we know of, and do we know how effective these different approaches are? Or Arvin, you can take it in the direction that you'd like to.
I mean, I can talk a bit about, and maybe to explain to the audience, like, where some of these things fit in. I think you're right. There's an entire spectrum of things you could be doing at different points. I'm working on a paper right now, actually, on where structured public feedback and things like red teaming can help inform all these different stages. So, when you are interacting with a model that's out there in the world, this isn't like just a model they've trained and then threw out into the world. There's just been a lot of work that's done on top of it, especially as you mentioned, some of these like guardrails that have been put up. And then the interesting question becomes, and this is why a hacker community is interesting when we talk about red teaming, right? This is where malicious actors can come in and essentially try to break some of these safeguards. And sometimes one interesting thing that I'm finding in digging through the DEF CON data is that sometimes it's not even you're not like maliciously doing it, but there's this like light social engineering you do where you're like, I'm a mom and my kid is sick home from school. Like you've given it some scenario and then it responds accordingly. But that's actually how people may interact with these systems. So it's not when people create these social engineering scenarios, they do it maliciously. But increasingly, as I'm thinking about how people are going to be interacting and how they interact with these models, that may actually be how they talk to them and inadvertently socially engineer. So I'm curious to see, and like I don't think there's really research because like I said, we're just kind of digging through the DEF CON data, and that's something that I'm seeing is there are some gray area things with embedded harms where someone's like, I just did light social engineering. Somebody would actually do this. Or I'm like, actually, I agree with you. Well, I'm curious to see how one may accidentally bypass the system a safeguard by essentially engineering your way around it, because the easiest way to break any of these safeguards is to like say like, you know, pretend I'm a blah, right? Or like I've gotten approval to do X, which is very easy to type in. So I wanted to add that part, and maybe it's not exactly answering your question, but it's an interesting nuance that I'm seeing with some of the results. It's not as cut and dry as saying malicious actor, unintended consequence.
Yeah, I can just add one thing. I think like, yeah, it's really important. The other aspect of like seeing whether a model exhibits harmful behavior in other languages is that oftentimes these LLMs are also used as content moderation tools. So they're fine-tuned. And in fact, you don't have data like at all for like multilingual content moderation sometimes. Like now there are a lot of efforts. I think that's why Roman's effort is so important. But like even in many foundational papers that are not able to analyze multilingual toxicity because there are no established benchmarks for such. So then it comes all the way around. So if you want to prevent harmful content by people on the internet in different languages, how do you do that? So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important point that I want to articulate and then put a pin in for future panelists, for future panels today and tomorrow to actually get to, is that content moderation, I think, happens at different points and can happen at different points. You could specifically try to remove training data that you might not want to be in the foundation model in the first place. You might try to moderate how humans are interacting with a chatbot and say, if you try to prompt it in a way that goes against some kind of guidelines, the model refuses to answer or kind of diverts. You might have something that specifically tries to affect the output of a model so that it doesn't produce something that violates some kind of guidelines or standards. And then you have the models that are maybe playing a role in the moderation of content outside of the context of generative AI, but maybe just on other content generated sites. So I think that's just a really important distinction and detail that will be relevant throughout the rest of the day. But I want to turn to you, Arvin. I know you had a couple other thoughts you wanted to add.
Sure. So I wanted to point out that for certain types of harms, the most effective interventions might be located far from the model itself. Not in the pre-training, not in the fine-tuning, nothing really to do with the product development. And this might feel a little uncomfortable to say because it feels like, oh, these AI companies are developing models with these harmful side effects and externalities, and we're saying that the interventions should be located somewhere else, someone else should be doing it, who should be doing it? And why are they allowed to put the costs on someone else? I do think that's a problem. I'll come back to that. And I think policies should be the solution there. But to give an example of what I'm talking about, I spent more than a decade in cybersecurity before I started working on AI. And there's a lot of concerns, partly about the security of the models themselves. Ramon, of course, talks about that, but also about the use of these models by hackers, by bad actors, for finding security vulnerabilities in regular software, whether it's consumer software or software that controls our critical infrastructure. And that can be really catastrophic if they can find new so-called zero-day vulnerabilities that have not been patched using this tool that is, incredibly good at coding and, in fact, at finding security vulnerabilities. What are we going to do? And should we fine-tune the models to refuse to answer questions about security? I think some of the providers try to do some of this, not at all effectively. Okay. What's going to happen now? There are open source models, right? So here's what I would say to that. If the issue is that AI can now find security vulnerabilities more effectively than humans, and that's a problem, then we lost that battle 20 years ago. in cybersecurity, we've long had software, even before AI. It's a form of AI, I guess you could call it. Tools like fuzzers, many, many others that are automated tools that can, static analysis tools can look at large million-line code bases, and they're not necessarily as capable as experts, at cybersecurity, but they're much faster and they can do a lot of this more effectively. And so a large fraction of security vulnerabilities today are already found using the assistance of automated tools. So you might ask, turning the clock back a decade or two ago, did the arrival of these automated tools give the hackers a big leg up? No, of course, not at all. It actually gave the defenders a leg up because developers of software could now use the tools on their own software before they released it to the public. And the other big thing was that bug bounties were instituted. That is the single most important development that's happened in cybersecurity in the last couple of decades. It's now considered essential for any software that is not totally trivial, which is that you have to have a program by which if someone discovers a vulnerability, they are able to report it to you in exchange for a monetary reward. And so what that has done is it has turned would-be hackers into defensive experts. Instead of selling it to the highest bidder who might be using it for compromising people's devices, now they can sell it to the vendor of the software in order to help protect the software. So exactly those methods are going to continue to work, I think, for AI-enabled vulnerability finding. And they are already starting to work. For instance, DARPA and the White House have announced a $20 million program for using AI for detecting vulnerabilities. And they've done many like this before, but I think this one, a big component of that is going to be LLMs. So this is an example of where the defense is not located in the model. The defense, if anything, uses the model to then protect the software that is going to become vulnerable, right? And so I think it's actually not important to try to prevent these models from finding vulnerabilities. It's a good thing if these models are able to find security vulnerabilities. We should make that capability widely available, but we should structure our incentives so that those vulnerabilities are helping to protect software rather than to attack software. Let me quickly give one other example. I know we're running short on time. Same thing with AI-generated disinformation. There's a lot of concern about this, obviously. However, I would say that the methods that we have to fight disinformation on social media, they certainly need adaptation. We don't need to throw them away and start to come up with something completely new for AI-generated disinformation. The point that my co-author Sayash and I have tried to make is that when it comes to AI and disinformation, the cost of generating disinformation has never been the bottleneck. That's only been, I don't know, maybe 10% of the overall cost. The hard part is getting that in front of people on social media and persuading them to believe it and that sort of thing. That's like 90% of the cost, and that hasn't changed. So this is not something catastrophic. Of course, we need to respond to this, but we should do it by strengthening the methods that we already have instead of panicking and trying to fix the models themselves, which is also important. We need to make technical changes to the models, but I think the most important interventions are going to be the responsibility of social media companies. I'll stop there.
So I agree to a point, but I'm going to disagree with you. So I think you're correct. Like, I think there is an incorrect focus on the ability to generate information. But what I'll add is, of course, social media, generative AI is making it easier to create misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So I'm working on, one is that's one of the things we're testing in our next red teaming exercise with the Royal Society. What we're doing is we're actually bringing COVID and climate scientists in, and we're actually having them design misinformation campaigns. So actually what I worry about is that, let me start from the beginning. I'm also working on a paper on online gender-based violence and generative AI, and essentially as these models improve, so you can work with Copilot to create code that will enable you to post to someone's social media account every 10 minutes. It's not actually a malicious thing to do necessarily, but then you also work with a large language model to say, generate 10, like I'm writing a script for a movie where this guy is sexually harassing this girl. and give me 15 things he would say to her to be like malicious, and then I'll do it for you. So now and then you're like, make it into a CSV and format it this way. And then now you have your code, and then now you have your generated script. The other thing we do, so before Gamergate, there was something people actually are very unfamiliar with. One of the first instances of the alt-right using fake accounts to perpetuate harmful stereotypes against people were people alt-right folks doing it about Black feminists. And they created all these fake accounts where they were posting as if they were Black feminists and saying all sorts of weird things that would fit into all the stereotypes they're trying to perpetuate. One of the ways it was easy to catch them is like they don't know how to talk the way women talk, Black women talk, and this particular community of women talk. One thing that's a little bit easier to do now is to translate into different dialects, languages, and dialogues. So while it is not easy to build a custom language model in that language, what you can do is take some text and say, translate this into multiple languages, and they'll reasonably do that for you, right? So now I can take my CSV, which is in English, say, do it in African-American vernacular English, do it in this, do it in Spanish, do it in whatever. And like, so it does become easier to create a campaign in a way that you haven't been able to do before. But I do agree with you that like, I think there is a focus on generation that is misguided for many reasons. What I worry about is how easy it's going to be to build and scale misinformation campaigns.
Amazing. I'm loving the back and forth, and I love that the conversation turned also to the broader landscape that these models are operating within, because as we all know, hopefully at this point, these are socio-technical systems. People are engaged in both producing the systems, engaging with them, and being subject to their outputs, which is always critical to remember. And I did get permission to go a few minutes over because the initial session was delayed by a few minutes. So I'd love to turn to questions at this point, and two of them are about just that, the people. Who, some of you have used the phrase "we." A question is, who are the we? Who are the people engaged in building and testing and using these systems? And what are the roles that different communities are playing in these conversations? And I think we had sort of another question on a different angle, which is there's often concern about transparency and bias and fairness in AI models, but humans are also challenged by those same issues. And so, are the risks of AI different, larger, et cetera, than humans, or how do humans and systems interact in this space?
I can build on the we question. I think the other we is like, who is the we that's even represented in these models, right? So even like the very basic fundamental question, and the lie that's sort of being told is that like, this is the representation of human knowledge, and it's not. It is a large swath of information that exists. First of all, it's got to exist on the internet. It's got to exist in digital form. It's actually not a lot of knowledge. It's actually not a wide range of people. It's a particular subset of people. Second is that it's taken from things that were not intended to be built to make large language models, right? So this could be interactions on Reddit. Like that's kind of the big one people point to, is like Reddit's used as a training set. Well, like who's on Reddit and what are they talking about? What are the images they're sharing? Is that representative of the world? Short answer, no. And even something like Wikipedia, right? So you could say, okay, well, like fine, Reddit full of trolls. Wikipedia, it's this like source of knowledge. It's not. So Anasuya Sengupta runs this group called Who's Knowledge, and she's been working for years to create more diversity on Wikipedia. We also know that Wikipedia has bias because it's moderated by human beings, where women not only tend to have fewer pages, women's pages tend to be contested even more. So even this idea of like Wikipedia being this like wonderful place to get objective information. Frankly, we used Wikipedia as our like source of information during DEF CON, right? We know that too is a biased practice. So like, I'm not answering the question. I'm just saying like, let's expand the we to even say like, who is the we in this like representation that is being claimed that this large language model has knowledge of?
Arvin.
Thank you, Ramon. That was great. I want to take a stab at the other question on human bias versus AI bias. Aren't we also biased? We've looked at this. We have a paper relating to this, but specifically in the context of predictive AI. So let me look at it in that scenario, whether you're using it for hiring or in the criminal justice system, or a bank is using it in so many other scenarios. Yes, of course, it's true that people are biased. People can't always explain their decisions. And that is why over centuries and millennia, we have evolved procedural protections. It's the whole difference between the rule of a person and the rule of law. And that's the reason why, even in a relatively simple context like university admissions, I can't just admit or make decisions however I want. There are processes in place precisely because we recognize the limits of individual human judgment. And so I think the right comparison is not between human judgment and automated decision making, but the procedural systems that we have in bureaucracies, for lack of a better word, which has negative connotations, but also important protections built into it, those versus automated decision-making systems. And the reason that's important is because these procedural protections, if they didn't exist, you could imagine things like, I don't know, a misformatted letter, get someone kicked out, or those types of catastrophic things, right? That we know not to allow in the real world because we have those processes in place. When you have automated decision-making systems, they often make those, egregious errors. And there are no oversight mechanisms in place. A data field was wrong, and so someone gets denied their welfare benefits, for instance, right? That sort of thing. Very, very common. There are so many investigative reports of this. And so we've looked at the vendors of these automated decision-making systems, and they'll say, oh, no, this is why you have to, we're not recommending that it be used in a purely automated way. You have to have a human fallback for everything. And someone came up with this beautiful term of moral crumple zones, where the accountability is being put on the human, wherein they were in fact not in a really good position to evaluate every AI decision and make a different decision if necessary. So what you end up with is a bait and switch. A bait and switch in the sense that these automated decision-making tools are sold on the promise of cost cutting, of getting those human decision-making makers out of the picture, efficiency, and in some cases, a lower bias compared to individual humans and so on. All of that sounds good until you look at these inevitable problems that arise and you look at the fine print of these tools, which actually require you to have the same humans in place that you were trying to get rid of. And that's a contradiction, right? So that's the bait and switch. And so if you want to put procedural protections back into automated decision-making systems, it seems like you're not actually achieving much over human decision-making. I'm not saying automated decision-making should never be used, but I think it's far more complex than a simple comparison between human bias and machine bias.
And I think to your point, and we've talked about automated decision-making a little bit in this panel. We've also talked about generative AI. Those are increasingly coming together. Some of my research is in the area of hiring, and what hiring software providers tend to do is text parsing, resume parsing. Chatbots are quite popular and emerging. And so I think while those have some distinctions, these different types of AI, they're coming together into systems that we need to think about. And I think to your point, Arvin, and Ruman and everyone we were talking about is, how do we have the right safeguards and tests to know what the systems are even doing in order to make sure that they're not violating our expectations or the laws or the safeguards that we've set. Ruman, I see your hand, but we have just one more minute. I want to pose one more question, and then maybe you can address it there, because I think it's so interesting. We were talking about who is the we. Some folks have postulated that generative AI might actually help generate more diverse data sets. What do you think about that? Is that realistic? What problems might that pose? To your Arvin, to your point, sometimes the tool also might be part of the solution. Is that the case here, or are there other issues we should think about before diving into that?
I actually I was literally, so one of the reasons I was late to this was my call before this went over, where literally we were talking about that. So I'm going to possibly be on an episode of Marketplace Tech next week talking about exactly this. So like I think it provides a really good stopgap measure. So I don't want to, I hate throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I love the idea. Here's where I think it falls apart. This idea of using images to train other models, I've been calling it AI inbreeding. I think other people, it's just basically classic overfitting. But I think inbreeding really does, especially because it's images, and then it starts to hit this weird uncanny valley. And so I feel like that term kind of illustrates exactly what it is. But really kind of it's going to be another manifestation of overfitting a model. The second thing is the problem here is that we have very diverse images of like white people and very diverse images of white men in particular. Actually, we probably have the most diverse images of white women, actually, probably more than white men. I'm just going to completely guess that. But based on the fact that like most advertising imagery is about achieving this ideal, which is a young, pretty white woman, right? So I'm going to guess that we have the most diverse images on the internet about white women. But then we're going to like, it sounds nice to say that we're going to make some pictures of Black women, right? But like Black women don't all look the same. Like we're three different South Asian people on this call. We actually look very different from each other. There are two South Asian men on this call. They look different from each other too. So what is this generating when you say it's making like a Black woman bartender? Is it like, what is the skin tone it's going to choose? What's going to be this person's hairstyle? Do they have piercings or no? Do they have tattoos? What are they wearing? And like the thing is like all of these actually stylistic choices real human beings make. And some of that may actually be somewhat intertwined with their culture, right? So if you want to generate like multiple images of South Asian women, are they all going to look like Priyanka Chopra? Like, and South Asians have a wide range of skin tones and like the facial features, literally facial features. Who are you making and what are they going to look like? So like I love the idea in principle. I think it works in like these very small and narrow ways. However, I worry about the like creating data to train data, like something weird here. And then fundamentally, like we're not going to create diverse images. We're just going to create whatever the stock photo is that it's going to reproduce.
We're about out of time. Final word from Arvin or Pratik, but maybe if anyone can stay on and answer some of the questions via the Q&A box, that'd be great. But before we last word, just thanks to everyone on the panel for all your great input. Seems like we're all done. Okay, thank you all so much. Hope that this laid a great foundation for the rest of the day and tomorrow. And thank you, Emma, for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. Miranda, Arvin, Ruman, and Pratik, we really, really appreciate your time. And that was just a fantastic conversation to get us started for another couple of panels today and tomorrow. So to keep the conversation going now and to guide us through a deeper dive into how we should think about generative AI, specifically in the context of elections, I'm happy to welcome the moderator of our next panel, Will Adler. Until very recently, Will was our esteemed colleague here at CDT, and he's now the Associate Director of the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Also, a quick programming note, unfortunately, Renee DiResta from Stanford Internet Observatory has gotten caught up in some travel issues and won't be able to join us for this panel. So we're very sorry we won't be able to hear from her today, but we've still got a great panel planned. So Will, over to you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Emma. And thanks, Miranda, for moderating that awesome panel. That was great. So yeah, I led the elections project at CDT for 3 years, but I don't think I ever moderated a FOSO panel. So this is a big honor. So the previous panel focused on the nuts and bolts of large language models, which have, of course, dominated the tech policy conversation for the last year or more. And this panel is going to focus on a particular domain that almost everyone thinks is going to see a huge impact from generative AI, but no one necessarily agrees on what that impact will actually be. So I'm talking about my primary policy interest, which is elections. Generative AI poses all sorts of interesting questions for people who care about elections, which should be all of us. Generative AI promises to be a boon for small campaigns, helping them to generate boilerplate fundraising text and social media posts and so on. But there are, of course, concerns that it could be a boon for foreign adversaries as well, who might use it to make influence operations more convincing. There are questions about how much of an impact AI will have on elections or whether those fears are overblown. And I'm also wondering whether the mere presence of generative AI in our environment will have the effect of making it harder for the public to trust what they read online, even from what would normally be considered trustworthy sources. So to get into all this, I've got a great panel, even though Renee DiResta would not be joining us. So I'll be able to introduce our remaining two speakers. You guys can turn your cameras on if you're able. Katie Harbath is the chief executive of Anchor Change, where she helps clients think through tech policy issues. She also has positions at the Bipartisan Policy Center, where I work, the Integrity Institute, and the Atlantic Council. Katie spent 10 years at Facebook, now Meta, leading teams that managed elections around the world. And before Facebook, she held senior digital roles at the Republican National Committee, the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and the DCI Group. So Katie, thank you for being here. And we also have Josh Goldstein. Josh Goldstein is a research fellow at Georgetown's CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where he works on the Cyber AI project. So prior to joining CSET, he was a pre- and postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Internet Observatory, and his research has included investigating covert influence operations on social media platforms, studying the effects of foreign interference on democratic societies, and exploring how emerging technologies will impact the future of propaganda. All, of course, extremely relevant here. So Josh, thanks for being here as well. Yeah, before we kick things off, I just want to warn everybody that at 2:20 p.m., 50 minutes into this panel, you will receive an alert on your phone. Don't be alarmed. It's not a mass influence operation. It's just a test of the National Emergency Alert System. I think it's great that it's going to happen in this panel. Type in the chat. Let us know if you get the alert, and I'll let the feds know if it looks like everything is working. So I want to open a question to both of you. So a few years ago, Renee DiResta wrote a piece in The Atlantic called "The Supply of Disinformation Will Soon Be Infinite." OpenAI had just released GPT-3, but it wasn't yet widely available to the public and also not yet available in the ChatGPT chatbot interface that has become so popular. She wrote the generative AI tools have the potential to supercharge global propaganda operations by making it easier to generate convincing text content from convincingly real-seeming personas. And so my question for both of you is, are we now living in that future? So in the years since the article was published, there's been a lot of advancement in the technology, and it's been made widely available to the public. But I don't feel like I've read too many news stories about AI being used to generate text for global influence operations. Have bad actors not leveraged generative AI or not yet taken advantage of it as much as people might have predicted? Or do you think it's just hard to know? I'd love your assessment of how generative AI is being used to influence people on the internet right now. Katie, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Will and CDT, for having me. I think I've set my phone onto the right settings so you don't hear an alarm at 2:20, but we'll see if that happens. This is an area where I kind of like to tell people we should be panicking responsibly. And what I mean by that is that I think that there's still a lot of potential for AI, right? And there's a lot of things that we are looking at that could potentially happen, but there's still a long ways to go. And we're seeing some examples of things pop up, and we've seen stories of Chinese and Russian influence using AI. We've seen some campaigns use AI, but there's still a long way to go in terms of folks really adapting these tools, building the things that they need to create all of this and do all of that. So I think there's still kind of a gap between where we imagine it could go and where we are in reality, which means there's still opportunity, right? In terms of thinking about how we deal with that. And I think it's also really important to know that not only will AI absolutely help with creating that content, AI is also going to help to detect that content. And so we really are going to continue to be in sort of this cat and mouse game as the nefarious actors look to use this technology to help their interest, and the people whose job it is to try to stop them, try to find and close those types of loopholes.
Yeah, actually, Katie, I want to follow up with you on that because it built on something that came up at the end of the previous panel. Arvin was talking about AI in the security context, how it can be used by both attackers and defenders, and you're kind of touching on that too. So I wonder if you can describe that dynamic in elections. So, if AI is used by those who spread disinformation or would otherwise cause harm, how might it be used to detect these kinds of attacks? How well does that work? How reliable is it? That kind of thing.
Yeah, my most experience is how this works inside of a tech company in terms of this. So, there's a lot of different forms of AI, right? Like we're talking in this instance, there's generative AI, which is actually creating the images, the text, the video and stuff like that. But there are other forms of AI that companies have used for a long time to create what are called classifiers to try to proactively find violating content. And that technology continues to get better to better help the systems know the right context that things are in, to better detect, in video and audio of what this might look like. And they're nowhere near perfect, but they keep getting better every single day. And there might be challenges, with that too, in terms of how they're training and kind of think about those. And so, I think they will be used to try to detect this type of content, help to prompt people to add, we're having a lot of conversation about labels, watermarks, how you can tell what this different type of stuff is. Companies will be able to use AI in order to help people to better understand what it is that they might be looking for, and to make sure that that's not going viral on the platform without the right labels. A lot of this is all still being figured out right now, and OpenAI, in fact, had a great piece, I think it was like in August, talking about how they're using AI for content moderation. Because, for instance, if we can get that to be used to find the worst of the worst on the internet, and we know that that really weighs heavily on human content moderators, and if we can try to automate that as much as possible, that's going to really make this work a lot easier for the humans who are having to look and deal with that stuff every single day.
Got it. Thanks. Josh, let's go back to you on this first question. How, in your view, is generative AI being used to influence people right now?
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me. Thanks also to Katie for a great set of opening comments. I think the short answer to the question you posed is, I think you're right that there aren't a lot of news stories so far of researchers finding campaigns which have been attributed to particular political actors using language models. But I do think that we have evidence that language models are being used in deceptive ways in conversations or to spread news online. So for one example, NewsGuard has reported that they found more than 500 unreliable AI-generated news websites in at least 14 different languages, which it seems like those are primarily motivated by finance, but we can expect that others will be doing the same related to politics. There are also a bunch of different examples of open source researchers finding accounts on Twitter, for example, that are hooked up to language models or chatbots and talking about both politics and other types of content. I think part of the reason that we haven't seen reporting on it is because some of those campaigns haven't been attributed. And from a higher level of, are we living in the world that Renee described 3 years ago? I think it's just really hard to tell. I think we don't know. And there are two challenges I see here. The first we could call the denominator problem, which is that we don't know all of the influence operations or the covert propaganda campaigns that exist, that are out there, right? We learn about the campaigns that researchers, independent researchers, or investigators inside companies discover and then release, but we don't have a sense as a disinformation field. And this is a problem prior to AI about what % of all operations are we finding to begin with. So first, we don't know how many campaigns exist. And then second, of the campaigns that are found where people can detect coordination between accounts, they can detect that, for example, a single person is running many different accounts and inflating their impact or their role in a public conversation. There's the detection problem, which is when campaigns are caught, if detection of AI-generated text isn't reliable, we may not know that language models are being used. So I think just at a very high level, it's hard to know because we don't know what campaigns are out there. We don't know which are using language models, and we probably need more creative ways of surfacing.
That makes a lot of sense. And Josh, to build on the second problem, which is we don't know how to detect it, why is it important to detect it? Why is it important to know if a campaign leverages generative AI? Is that important for attribution, assigning blame, for responding in other ways? Give me a sense.
Yeah, so I think that on a campaign by campaign, or maybe on the scale of a given piece of information, it may not be so problematic whether or not we know. So if one tweet from a so-called disinformation actor is written by a real person or is written by AI, that may not have a big impact on whether it changes somebody's view, or it may not be more problematic from the perspective of the outcome being harm. But I think that when we think on a broader scale, it becomes important. So here are a couple of reasons. One is right-sizing public perceptions. In late August, YouGov ran a poll of Americans, and they asked them about how concerned they are, if at all, about the possibility of AI resulting in different consequences. And the consequence that was most concerning was the spread of misleading video and audio deepfakes. And the second most concerning was the spread of political propaganda. 85% of people were very concerned or concerned about misleading video and deepfakes. 78% were very concerned or concerned about the spread of political propaganda resulting from AI. So if it's the case that language models are not being used in influence operations broadly, then I think it's important that the public is aware of that to help right size or downsize the threat. If, on the other hand, they are being used widely, then maybe public perception is justified. And you might ask, why does it matter if the public is concerned? Well, if the public is concerned about AI-generated propaganda, that has effects in and of itself. It could lead to less trust in election results. It could lead to less trust in online information environments. It could lead people to think that content they disagree with is AI-generated and content they don't is actually written by real people. So I think one is just trying to help the public understand the magnitude of threat. Another is prioritization. There are a lot of different potential harms that could come about from generative AI tools, in addition to all of the beneficial applications, which I'm sort of setting aside for a moment. For example, phishing, spam, harassment, cyber, creating bioweapons. There are non-malicious uses like going to a chatbot and it returning false health information. And both people in companies and academic researchers only have a set amount of time. They need to prioritize what issues they focus on. So if language models aren't broadly being used in disinformation campaigns or aren't having a big impact, maybe that should be a lower priority than other things. So detection is important there. And then the last one, sorry, I'm going on a little bit long here, is it also relates to policy decisions. If language models are being used for disinformation campaigns, then that may have an impact on model release decisions, like how accessible to make certain models, or public policy decisions, like how to regulate models and how to weigh the harmful applications against some of the positive ones. So I think we want to move from a world where we talk about AI can generate disinformation sort of in theory to studying whether this is actually occurring, so we know how much weight to place on certain risks against others and against potential benefits.
Got it. I have another question to build on a debate that came up in the previous panel. So Raman Chowdhury in the previous panel said that it's a problem that AI makes it easier to generate convincing and highly localized disinfo. But on the other hand, Arvin Narayanan said that that's always been easy, and the bottleneck for disinfo is getting it in front of people. So Katie, I want to kind of follow up on that debate with you here, and this sort of touches on what Josh was talking about, which is, what's really changed here about disinformation. What's your take on that debate from the previous panel?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that because I think it's fair that, about needing to get it distributed, but you also don't need to get it in front of a lot of eyeballs for it to have an impact. So one of the things I would first caution us against is thinking that it's only things that go viral that can have an impact, right? I mean, if you think about hyperlocal stuff, this is one of the things we were worried about back in 2020 when I was at Facebook, and AI is going to be able to better help people to be able to create that type of hyper-localized content at a much better speed, more likely at less cost. So because I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin, so if I see something that's saying that's what's happening for my election in Green Bay, and it specifically says my city or my county or something like that, I might be believing that more than if it's just more generic message. And so I would look at that as something to be concerned about. But on the flip side, there also isn't infinite inventory available for them. And I wonder how much of this would be organic versus paid. And on the organic side, with platforms like Facebook deprioritizing politics and news, what will that mean will it be harder to distribute this? Will they have to put more money behind it to make it paid? You have a lot of platforms that are choosing to ban political ads, some aren't. So this is where I'm kind of like, I think there's gonna be a lot of different vectors that this could appear on, and could be hyper localized that that could have an impact.
Yeah, so I mean, Katie, there have always been trolls on the internet. There have always been bots. There's always been synthetic content. in some ways, it's kind of hard to know whether the rise of AI is this a tectonic shift for the platforms in terms of content moderation, or is it just something that changes like the quantity of synthetic targeted content? I mean, how much of a game changer is this?
I think it's still a little hard to tell, but I do think that this is going to be an election. I remember back in 2012, one of the tools that some of the platforms introduced was the ability to have custom audiences. So a campaign or advertiser could upload the list of their email addresses that they had, match that to people on these platforms, and serve ads to them. And that was a tool that wasn't released, at least not at Facebook, until beginning of 2012. And then by the end of 12, I remember there were campaigns being like, why didn't you tell us this was going to be available? We would have put so much more money into it. And I think there's a decent chance there's an AI tool that's used both maybe for good and bad, maybe one or the other, that's being built right now, that we don't even know that exists, that is going to have an impact on this campaign. And so I think the potential is there. For this technology to have more impact than what we've seen from other technologies in recent elections. But again, this is where I'm kind of like putting some caution out there around panicking responsibly, because I think at the end of the day, it's not a single technology that's going to help a candidate win the race. There's a lot of different factors that go into this. There is a lot that is happening in our country and has been happening in our country that is going to play here. And I think it would be very foolish for us to think there's going to be one silver bullet or one single thing that is going to cause any candidate in which to win. And so while we should be definitely paying attention to AI, we have to make sure that we broaden our aperture overall in terms of the information environment that we'll be going into as we go into 24.
And Josh, what's your take? Of course, propaganda campaigns predate AI and even predate the internet. So what makes an AI-generated propaganda campaign different in terms of how they operate, their effectiveness, and how we should respond?
Yeah. So first, I agree with everything Katie said. In a paper that I published in January with colleagues from the Stanford Internet Observatory, Georgetown, CSET, and OpenAI, we tried to think about what are the ways that language models could impact the ABCs of disinformation campaigns. So we're borrowing a framework that Camille Francois described about the actors, behaviors, and content of disinformation campaigns, and applying that to covert influence operations and the role language models can have. And I'm just quickly going to lay out a few of those potential changes. So first, in terms of the actors, if you have a language model that you can use to generate content, it can significantly drive down the number of propagandists that are required for a given campaign. So right now, there are campaigns that rely on troll farms that pay hundreds of people to write hundreds of posts per day to then use on social media platforms. But if you have a language model, you can drive down the number of people that are required to write the same amount of content because they can just have a language model do that for them. This is problematic in part because it may make campaigns less discoverable. One of the ways that we learn about how troll farms and propaganda campaigns run is investigative journalists will infiltrate them. They'll apply for job openings, or they'll interview propagandists that work at a troll farm. But if you don't need as many people to create the same amount of content, there may be fewer opportunities for journalists to find that information out. So first is reducing the number of propagandists. This could lead to a larger and more diverse group of people waging campaigns because they're simply cheaper to run. And lastly, it could create some newfound importance of disinformation for hire firms. Right now, there's a global market of firms that will run propaganda campaigns on social media platforms for you if you pay them. And if certain marketing or PR firms integrate language models effectively into their campaign, then political actors can use these tools for propaganda purposes, even if they don't know how to use a language model or don't want to interact with it themselves. So there are some changes to the potential actors. The behaviors, you no longer need to rely on copy pasta or copy and pasted repeated text across accounts. If you can ask a language model to make one argument in 30 different ways for you, that may look more like real public opinion as well. And language models could potentially usher in more novel tactics. Like we've touched on personalization of propaganda, maybe even influence operations via one-on-one chat. We've also done some work looking at the content, and right now, at least in foreign influence operations, people writing content are not necessarily fluent in the language or the culture of their target audience. But language models can do a pretty good job of sounding like an American. So one concern I have is that it just lowers the barrier of entry or the necessary linguistic or cultural knowledge to wage an effective propaganda campaign on the part of different foreign propagandists.
Got it. You touched on something that was actually, in the when you started talking about actors and cost, you touched on something that an audience member asked us in the Q&A, and actually I encourage everybody watching to also submit your questions via the Q&A. You said that AI makes the operations cheaper, but one audience Q&A actually speculates the opposite, that maybe malign actors might find it too expensive to use AI, and given that they've already been able to run effective operations on the cheap without AI, they might not actually use that. Can you give me a sense of a little bit more about the cost question?
Yeah, so I think that there's a question around the cost, and there's been some preliminary work on cost modeling. I would point to a preprint paper by Micah Musser, which looks at this question and tries to approximate the cost of a propaganda campaign of a given size with or without language models. And I think it really comes down to a few different factors. So one is what % of the output are usable. If you rely on a language model to generate content, but only 1 in 10 output are usable, that requires a lot of human oversight. You need somebody to review each output and determine whether or not it should be used in a campaign. If instead a really high percentage are usable, they look enough like something a real person would write, or if your goal is distraction, it's to flood an information environment, not necessarily to persuade somebody of any one perspective, then using a language model will drive down the costs. And I guess to get more into specific features of the cost modeling analysis, I would point to that paper by Micah.
Got it. Katie, I want to talk a little bit about how the platforms seem to be preparing for the upcoming global election year, the first one in the age of widely available generative AI. What kind of plans have they put in place to treat AI-generated influence operations, and what kind of policies do you think they should have in place, in your view?
Yeah, I'm kind of watching this from a couple of different angles. One is, and I did a paper for BPC on this in May, and it was funny, even in the couple of weeks that we were putting together that blog post, how the platforms were handling this changed, particularly political content. So first and foremost is just, if you go in there and you ask, like I was asking the question, write me a blog post about the importance of voting. Some of the models would write me something, others would be like, I'm sorry, I can't do that right now, which means that they were probably blocking political content or prompts or stuff like that in which to do it. You have some platforms like OpenAI who have already put out policies around politics. So what are they actually stating is going to be their position on this? Google has come out and said that for any political ads using AI, they're going to require it to be labeled as such. I suspect that we will see other platforms following suit on that. Some of them might be waiting to see if the FEC does the rulemaking on this or not regarding that. And so there's sort of like, what are they doing behind the scenes? And then what are they being public about in terms of what their policies are? I know for a fact that many companies are trying to figure out exactly what they want to do here. Some of them are like, should we just block everything? We can't get it right. We know we can't get it right. We know this is so important. We don't want to screw it up. We don't want to target on our back. Maybe we try to block it all. That's going to be challenging because you still got to define what's political, right? You still have to define what counts as that. And it's somebody who had to try to define that. Let me tell you, it gets really hard, really fast when you think about that. And remember that the Russian Internet Research Agency ads ran in 2016. Most of them were issue-based. They did not mention a candidate or a party or anything like that. And so you need to kind of keep that in mind. I would hope that they are thinking about, whether or not there should be labels on this content, if that's different for organically versus paid advertising, how campaigns and other political actors and stuff can actually use these tools. How can general people use these to, whether it's, trying to put something in voice of a candidate or using images of candidates. This too is also not necessarily a new problem. It's just easier and kind of a bit more realistic, because you think about even back to like the Obama campaigns, right? The hope posters, there were many things that people created with the likeness of Barack Obama that wasn't necessarily sanctioned by the campaign, probably used Photoshop, probably used Adobe Illustrator, but you could tell that those were that type of thing. And so watching what the campaigns are doing there, what types of policies they have around the AI tools they're helping for advertisers, whether that's for targeting, for creating A/B tests of different things, and stuff like that would also be stuff that I'm paying attention to of what the platforms do. It's still up in the air of what exactly those policies are going to be, and I think that's just because of how tough writing some of those policies are, and we as a society are still grappling with these ethical questions of what is or is not an acceptable use of this technology.
So you just touched on labeling possible synthetic content. Do you think there should be labels? Do you think it should differ between paid and organic content?
I struggle with this. I'll be honest. I haven't come down on a side yet, and I'll say why. With organic and paid, one of the interesting things I've seen over the years is most platforms have more stricter rules for paid content. And so I would see actors on these platforms, they would put out organic content, and then that would just go right up against the edge. And then a couple of days later, they would put out an ad that would dial it back just enough so it was acceptable for the political ad policies, but helped to reinforce what people were seeing organically. And so I don't think we can see these things in silos as paid versus organic. So in that world, I think they should be the same. Mm-hmm. In reality, it is somewhat different in terms of like, if you have a lot of money to put money behind this and get it in front of a lot more people, there's the potential of having more damage that way. So I'm not sure on the organic versus paid. Same thing on the labels. One of the things I'm worried about is that we think that the solution to everything is we'll just label it. There's all sorts of labels that people put out there. When people are on their phones, you run the risk of having your entire thing just being labels. You also run the risk of people starting to just ignore the labels. We need to experiment with it. I think labels is one thing to look at, but I think we're going to have to look at many other ways of thinking about this to be able to help people to just understand what it is that they're seeing. Because I worry if we're like, okay, we labeled it, we're done, and we don't keep studying it, it's not going to actually have the effect that we hope that it will have.
Labeling also brings up all sorts of detection questions, right? Because once you start attempting to label synthetic content, that raises the possibility of false negatives, right? Synthetic content that goes undetected. And what does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, and the platforms dealt with this a little bit. If people remember, in 2019, there was that video of Nancy Pelosi that was slowed down. It wasn't using AI, it was just slowing down her voice. But a bunch of us platforms then tried to get into, okay, how do you define what might be manipulated media? What is synthetic media? What does that, again, look like? When you take a picture with your phone and you use a filter, some of those things can be considered AI that you're doing with them or things of that nature. So there's going to be a lot of real challenges around drawing the line and defining what this might look like and what should or should not be labeled. And then there's the question of, do you have the technology to detect it, like you mentioned, as part of that? So very much like I think we continue to ebb and flow on with fact checking labels and stuff like that on platforms and what is or is not effective. I think we're going to see the same thing in this AI space.
Well, so actually, I'm glad you brought up that specific piece of content. Where did platforms come down with the slowed down Nancy Pelosi video? And what if what if a slowed down video of Joe Biden were to go viral tomorrow? What would happen if it was exactly the same kind of content?
So what's interesting about that is the oversight board, just the Meta's oversight board that will take on cases, has just announced that they're going to take on a case. They'll be releasing it, I think, in the coming days, about a synthetic post about Joe Biden or depicting Joe Biden that they're going to be taking on. So that's going to be something for us to keep a very close eye on in terms of where the oversight board comes down in some of that. Forgive me, I hadn't gone back and totally refreshed myself on where we fell. I know that there's there's a component of it that reduces the virality of it. So another famous saying from Renee is, right, is speech, not reach, and that there's a difference between the two of those. So I know that some of the platforms look at, like, when those types of things happen, can we dramatically reduce the reach of them? What is the role of fact checkers? And forgive me, I'll have to go and look at the exact definition of where we try to land in terms of what was considered manipulated media at the time.
Got it. Josh, we talked about this detection question. How hard is it to detect whether an influence operation might have an AI component? What are some of the challenges there? And I also would love for you to speculate on this question of what it would mean if we did start labeling, attempting to label synthetic content.
Yeah, so to start on detection, I think I mentioned earlier in the conversation why it's so challenging to detect, and sort of the twofold. First, we don't know what campaigns exist, and then second, even when campaigns are caught, detection models aren't reliable. I published a piece in Lawfare pretty recently with my colleague Drew Lawn, where we tried to give an overview of some ways that people may discover that influence operations are being supported by language models. And maybe I'll just talk about a couple of those different buckets and what some of the limitations are. So the most obvious bucket, perhaps, is human detection of AI-generated text in the wild. Like, if we could read a post and tell if that it's AI generated, then that would solve much of the detection issue. Overall, we can't do that. Studies show that people really struggle to distinguish between AI and human-generated text. But there are some cases
this is
where
by design, right? It's supposed to generate human-looking text.
It's supposed to model language. Yeah. So there are some cases where we can, and that's when there are guardrail messages that are being posted on social media platforms. So when we see thousands of accounts posting as a large language model, I cannot, that's a sign that likely one of OpenAI's models is being asked to generate a certain kind of text. It's been trained to refuse that, and it's returning a refusal. A propagandist or some deceptive actor has linked a language model or a chatbot to a particular platform and hasn't filtered out those comments. So I think we can find some campaigns that way, but those are sort of the bottom of the barrel, the sloppy campaigns. And there's evidence of that in Amazon reviews, in conversations on Twitter, really across platforms. The next level may be automated detection or technical detection of AI-generated text. And there are a bunch of different tools that are publicly available that will give you some score about the likelihood of a particular piece of text being AI-generated. The issue is that they're unreliable. There are false positives. We know of cases where students have been accused of plagiarism, where they didn't actually enact it, and that has really bad consequences. From the perspective of a propagandist, you can also try to evade detection. So if a particular language model has a watermark, you could apply a paraphraser and just paraphrase the text to get rid of the watermark. Or you can try to ask a language model to write text that's less likely to be detected. I think that a few routes that may be more promising. One is, I mentioned earlier, the role that journalists can play. If journalists and investigators can apply for jobs in troll farms or interview propagandists, then I think that they may be able to service campaigns that way. But the issue is that it's really not scalable. It's not feasible for journalists to go and interview people in all of the different troll farms that exist. And we may also learn of campaigns by monitoring by AI providers or by intelligence organizations actually finding foreign adversaries using these tools when they're monitoring their capabilities. So we sort of try to lay out a range of different options, and I hope that others will come up with more creative ones because this is a relatively new challenge, at least on this scale.
And Josh, I'd also love for you to speculate on what happens if the platforms decide, okay, we are going to start attempting to detect and label synthetic content. What effect do you think that would actually have? Would it have this perverse effect of making people think that everything that's not labeled is necessarily not synthetic? Or, what happens if you start making that kind of thing, try and be transparent about it to users?
I think there are different ways to label. So one could be proactive labeling by a user, where when you upload content, you have the option of marking that it's AI generated. Another would be what you're describing, which would be detection or attempts at detection by a platform that they then put a label on. There would probably be different effects of those two types of labels. It's hard to sort of speculate at this. I think as a social scientist, I'm thinking this is something that we could test. Like, we can create different mock social media environments and label content, and then look at how that changes the views of content that's not labeled. There's been some preliminary work on this, but I think that this is an area where we need some more research before we can fully understand some of the downstream or side effects it may have.
Sure. Katie, so you let me know in the chat that you were able to pull up the current Facebook policy on manipulated media, and I'm wondering what you found and whether you think it's how you think it might apply to AI.
Yeah, so it basically says, do not post videos that have been edited or synthesized where the subject of the video said words they did not say, and the video is the product of artificial intelligence or machine learning that merges, combines a bunch of other language, or superimposes content onto a video and creating a video that appears to be authentic. And so, I think, when platforms create these policies, they sometimes tend to be broad because you want to be able to have flexibility depending upon what you see and what's happening on the platform to be able to action upon it. So my gut is that's going to apply to potentially a lot of artificial intelligence generative AI content that might actually appear on the platform. And the first thing I kind of thought of is they may be re-looking at that because there's the potential for it to be too broad, depending upon what people are putting out there. I totally understand about it says words that people did not say, but it's not clear in like what happened with the DeSantis PAC, where Trump wrote the words, but they're using AI to have Trump speak the words. And that's the fun part about being in this public policy space is that there's always circumstances that come where you're like, shoot, this doesn't fit exactly as I had it in my policy, right? As part of that. And then I think too, it doesn't talk about one of the biggest problems we saw around misinformation or disinformation is there's oftentimes kernels of truth in something, right? And so are we going to we'll see elements of AI where, what does this mean if the background is fabricated, but the candidate actually did say what they said? What if you're putting them in different locations? So it's going to be really broad, and I think they're going to have to figure out ways to narrow it down even further, because my gut is that given how important video is to the entire online ecosystem right now, that it's not going to be sustainable to just be taking down everything because it's not going to be clear, cut, and dry.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm using my phone as my webcam, and my phone blared the emergency alert, which is why I had to pull it down. I thought I'd turned off my alerts, but did you guys get it? Or did you turn off your phones?
I don't have it as 2:20 yet. So are you on a special list that you get alerted a smidge second early?
I'm in a special time zone that's 2 minutes ahead of you guys. So, on the topic of kind of like relating AI generated content to existing platform policies, one of the audience questions we have is about relating considering AI just a form of micro-targeting almost. So this person asks, do stronger privacy laws have a role to play here? For example, could restricting the collection, use, and transfer of personal data limit the effectiveness of micro-targeted disinfo campaigns? Katie, I wonder what you think about that, and then whether you think that basically just applies to AI generated content, in the same way.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, right? Around privacy, whether or not targeting is or is not something that we want to have happen, because I totally understand on one hand, the more targeted it is, maybe the less collective truth that we all have. On the other hand, somebody who has 2 young kids is probably going to care a lot more about education policy and maybe less about Social Security than their grandparents might, or something like that. And I think a lot of people, that's been a part of political campaigning for a really long period of time. And what I tend to notice when it comes to all of this is that a lot of this is rooted in just, again, the fear of what could be, the fear of not knowing what is going on, the fear that bad activity could be happening under our nose. People could be doing something that is going to change the course of the election, or have effects that we're not aware of. And so one of the things that gives me hope in all of this is that, for 15 years, we kind of had rose-colored glasses on about social media and the internet in general and how it's going to be the great democratizer. We've learned a lot in the last 6 to 7 years about how to mitigate those. And I'm really glad we're having these conversations about AI now, to be thinking about that. And so, yes, privacy legislation, others, all of this stuff is intertwined. And it's going to continue to be intertwined about how we think about this and where we want to have, we're in the middle of creating new societal norms about where we feel about all these different types of things. And Europe's going to be ground zero on this, right? They've got laws like the GDPR, they have the Digital Services Act that's starting to be implemented, the Digital Markets Act. We're going to start to see how these different pieces of regulation they're looking at an AI Act. We're going to start to see how those start to play off of one another and what the impacts of those are. And I think that we'll then likely see that start to spread elsewhere around the world, including here in the US.
Got it. Josh, earlier you touched on how convincing this content can be. And there is, a lot of speculation here that, well, if we give it a few demographic pointers about someone, it's going to be able to, generate really convincing content. But it seems to me that a lot of those fears are really speculative. But my understanding is that you've done some actual research on this, and I'm curious what that research was and what you found.
So I worked with a team of researchers, Jason Chow, Shelby Grossman, Alex Stamos, and Mike Toms. And we ran a set of survey experiments to look at how persuasive is content from language models compared to content from real foreign propaganda campaigns. We ran this study about 2 years ago, and we used GPT-3. So our results are probably a lower bound or a lower estimation of what language models could do today. The way that we structured the experiment was we had GPT-3 write articles on 6 topics. 3 of the articles were from a campaign that originated in Iran, and 3 were from a campaign that originated in Russia, both targeting English language audiences. And then we showed 8,000 Americans either the original propaganda, the AI-generated propaganda, or no propaganda, and asked them about the extent to which they agreed with the thesis statement. That was the main point that the propagandist was trying to convince the target. And what we found was the AI-generated propaganda was only a few percentage points worse than the original propaganda with no human curation. When we just took the first output from GPT-3, we used 3 GPT-3 output on each topic. And then when we mimic different human-machine teaming strategies, like throw out articles that don't make the main point we wanted it to, or select the best of 3 on each topic, or maybe lightly edit the example articles we've had to the model, then the GPT-3 propaganda was as persuasive or more persuasive than the original. So there are limitations to these types of studies, right? We're doing this in a laboratory environment. So it's different than if they were deployed out in the real world, but we can at least in these settings closely measure the impact of a particular stimulus. And in this case, we showed that language models write text that's as persuasive as content from real foreign propaganda campaigns. I think the piece that you just asked about and sort of discussed with Katie that is a new element is personalization. So how much more persuasive would content be if a propagandist fed a model information about the target? I think that this is to an extent unanswered. There has been some research exploring if you give a language model demographic information about a target and ask it to write an article, what effect does that have? And some of the research has cast doubt on some of the assumptions that it's as easy to personalize as researchers or policymakers have assumed. But some other research shows that personalization does have a big impact. So I think we're still in the relatively early phases of research, at least in sort of the social sciences, on the personalization capabilities of language models and what downstream impact that will have. And before turning it back over, I just want to give the reminder that just because language models may be able to personalize propaganda, and they may be persuasive when somebody's only shown one piece of information. We have to remember that the impact that these campaigns have are often limited because people form their opinions on a whole bunch of different input, right? You may see one piece of propaganda on a topic that's AI generated or not, but also see a bunch of real news articles on the same topic. So just because somebody can generate personalized propaganda or propaganda in general doesn't mean we should assume it has a big impact and will outweigh other factors like support for a candidate or their policies or information from other sources.
As a former psychological scientist myself, I'd love to take a deeper look at that study, and I imagine there might be other people too. So if you could paste a link to that that study that you just talked about in the chat, that'd be great. Katie, I have a question for you from the audience, which is about how the impact of generative AI might change in different countries with varying levels of democratic freedom. So you worked on elections all around the world at Meta, so I think you'll probably have a really great perspective here. This person asked, should the same policies exist in an emerging democracy that may have election irregularities, and should they be less relaxed in places with more robust, free and fair elections?
That's a really good question. And I think that's one where the devil's in the details. I could see in an ideal world where you might want to have those different rules. And I would highly recommend people check out the Freedom House just launched their Freedom on the Net report today that unfortunately shows global internet freedom declining, I think continuing to decline for the last 13 years. The challenges come in actually enforcing that. It comes in enforcing it. So being able to train content moderators on what different rules are for different countries can confuse them more, can cause more mistakes, can have a lot of challenges there. There's another one too, where defining where you draw the lines of the country. Freedom House does have free, partly free, not free, but trying to determine what country gets which things. And also having Americans or people from outside that country make that determination is something that gives me great pause. And it's something that we would really need to have, I think, and this is something I think the Oversight Board is trying to do with having a globally representative body as part of that. But there's a lot of things I would want to take into account before wanting to put in anything like that, because you can very quickly not intentionally, but accidentally introduce some biases and other things into developing that where your intentions are good, but the unintended consequences from those intentions and implementing those types of rules could have much more far-reaching effects.
Absolutely. Great. Well, we just have 2 minutes left, so I think I'm just going to wrap it up and thank our panelists, thank the audience for all these great questions, and thanks CDT for operating FOSO. Thanks so much, everybody. This has been really enlightening.
Thank you all.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you.
much. That was really great. Thank you, Katie, Will, and Josh. That is all the time we have for today, but please join us tomorrow, October 5th at noon Eastern for the second day of this year's Future of Speech Online. We'll be discussing what best practices in the field of generative AI could look like, and to the question about who is this we, who is actually shaping them. We'll also discuss the different liability and accountability frameworks that are under discussion and what their implications could be for the future development of these technologies. We'll also have a great group of lightning talks from folks who are already putting generative AI to work, including the American Journalism Project, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and Khan Academy. So we really hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks all.